The chandeliers in La Maison Céleste hung like frozen tears of light, their crystal pendants catching every flicker of the candles below and scattering rainbows across the mahogany walls. It was the kind of restaurant where a single appetizer cost more than most people's monthly grocery bills, where reservations were made 6 months in advance, and where the whispered conversations at each table could move stock markets or destroy political careers. Margot Bellamy moved through this world like a ghost. She carried the silver tray with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to make herself invisible, shoulders back but not proud, eyes attentive but never meeting, smile present but not presumptuous. Her uniform was impeccable, the crisp white blouse, the black pencil skirt, the sensible heels that whispered against the Italian marble floors. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a severe bun, not a strand out of place. She was, by design, unremarkable. But if anyone had bothered to look, really look, they might have noticed things that didn't quite fit the picture. The way her fingers occasionally traced the edge of a wine label with the reverence of someone reading sacred text. The slight furrow of her brow when guests mispronounced Chateau Margaux or confused a Burgundy for a Bordeaux. The flash of something in her green eyes whenever a particularly beautiful piece of French was spoken at a nearby table. Not confusion, but recognition. Longing. Tonight, those eyes carried shadows. Margot had arrived at work 3 hours early, as she always did, to help with the setup for what the management was calling the event of the season. The private dining room, the chambre d'or, with its hand-painted ceiling depicting the gardens of Versailles, had been reserved for a business dinner that would determine the fate of Maison Fontaine, the legendary French fashion house that had dressed queens and movie stars for over a century. She knew more about Maison Fontaine than anyone in that building. She had written 63 pages about its founding seamstress, Eloise Fontaine, for her doctoral dissertation at the Sorbonne. She had traced the evolution of Fontaine's signature embroidery technique through 3 centuries of French textile history. She had held, with trembling, white-gloved hands, original sketches from the 1920s collection that had revolutionized Parisian haute couture. That was 4 years ago, before the phone call, before the diagnosis, before her mother's medical bills began arriving like an avalanche, burying everything Margot had built, her career, her research, her future. She could still remember the exact moment it all changed. Standing in the neurology department at Columbia Presbyterian, listening to a doctor explain what early-onset Alzheimer's meant for a woman who was only 62. The words had seemed to come from very far away. Progressive, irreversible, requires specialized care. And then the numbers. The monthly costs. The years, 5, 10, 15, that the disease could stretch out, stealing her mother piece by piece while the bills mounted like a siege against everything Margot had ever hoped to become. Now she earned $11.50 an hour plus tips, lived in a studio apartment in Queens with a radiator that screamed like a wounded animal, and spent her rare free hours visiting her mother in the memory care facility that cost more per month than her dissertation stipend had paid in a year. The PhD from the Sorbonne, summa cum laude, with a specialization in French material culture and fashion history, gathered dust in a cardboard box under her bed, along with the letters of recommendation that had once promised her a tenure-track position at Columbia. Margot, the voice of Pierre, the maitre d', cut through her reverie. Table 4 needs water, and for God's sake smile. These are important people. Important people. As if she needed reminding. As if the Patek Philippe watches and the Hermès scarves and the casual way they left $100 tips without looking at the receipt didn't already announce it. She smiled. The trained smile, the invisible smile, and glided toward table 4 with her water pitcher. But her eyes kept drifting toward the chambre d'or, where white-jacketed servers were putting the final touches on the table settings. Sterling silver from Christofle, crystal from Baccarat, porcelain from Limoges, hand-painted with the Fontaine family crest, the twin roses intertwined with golden thread. She knew that crest. She had spent 3 months researching its symbolism, tracing its evolution from the original workshop sign in 1840 B7 to the modern logo that graced storefronts from Paris to Tokyo. Tonight, the people in that room would decide whether Maison Fontaine would survive another century or become just another casualty of the luxury conglomerate wars. And Margot would be there, invisible as always, pouring wine and clearing plates and pretending she didn't understand every word, every nuance, every lie. She didn't know yet that before the night was over, her invisibility would become the most dangerous weapon in that room. They arrived at precisely 7:45 p.m., and the restaurant's atmosphere shifted like barometric pressure before a storm. First through the door was Marcus Ashworth III, the American tech billionaire whose face had graced the covers of Forbes, Time, and Wired in the same month. He was tall, silver-haired, with the kind of handsome severity that came from decades of making decisions that affected thousands of lives. His suit was Savile Row, his watch was a vintage Vacheron Constantin, and his expression was that of a man who had never been told no and wouldn't know how to process it if he were. Margot recognized him instantly. Everyone did. His acquisition of Maison Fontaine had been the talk of the fashion world for months, the American disruptor buying the crown jewel of French heritage. The cultural commentators had been apoplectic. The business analysts had been ecstatic. The stock price had been volatile. Behind him came his entourage, a sleek woman in her 40s who was clearly his lawyer, 2 young men in identical dark suits who might have been assistants or bodyguards, and a silver-haired man with wire-rimmed glasses and a slight limp who walked with the self-assurance of someone who knew exactly how important he was. That last man made Margot's heart stumble. Dr. Alain Reynard. She knew the name like she knew her own heartbeat. He was the world's foremost expert on French fashion heritage, the authenticator who had verified more haute couture provenance than anyone alive. His book, Les Trésors de la Couture, had been her Bible during her dissertation years. His authentication had blessed the Maison Fontaine acquisition. His signature on the provenance documents had convinced Marcus Ashworth that he was buying not just a fashion house, but a legitimate piece of French history. And yet, something about him seemed wrong. Margot couldn't place it. A hesitation in his step, a flicker in his eyes, the way his fingers twitched against his thigh. The group was met by the sellers, the Fontaine heirs themselves, 3 generations of the founding family, dressed in the kind of understated elegance that only old money could afford. At their head was the matriarch, Madame Colette Fontaine Beaumont, 87 years old and still sharp as a Laguiole knife, her white hair swept up in a chignon that hadn't changed since 1962. Beside her stood a man who hadn't been in any of the press coverage. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from granite and then weathered by hard decisions. His suit was impeccable, but not flashy. His watch expensive, but not ostentatious. Philippe Fontaine Beaumont, Margot realized. Madame Colette's grandson, the family's fixer, the one they sent when deals needed to be saved or destroyed. He was also, according to the business press, the last holdout against the Ashworth acquisition, the one family member who had voted against selling. His presence tonight meant either he had finally been convinced or something was about to go very wrong. The parties exchanged greetings in the formal French manner, la bise, the double kiss, before switching to English for Ashworth's benefit. Margot noted with academic interest how the power dynamics shifted with the language. In French, Madame Colette was the sun around which everyone orbited. In English, Ashworth took center stage, his booming American confidence filling the space. Marcus Ashworth. Beautiful room, almost as beautiful as the company. He smiled at Madame Colette with the charm of someone who had practiced flattering people who didn't need flattery. Shall we make history tonight, Madame Colette? We shall see, Monsieur Ashworth. We shall see. They filed into the chambre d'or, and Margot followed with the wine list, invisible as ever. Pierre had assigned her to this table specifically because she was, in his words, decorative but forgettable, pretty enough to please the eye, plain enough not to distract from the business at hand. If only he knew. The first course was served, a delicate amuse-bouche of foie gras mousse with fig compote, and the conversation began in earnest. Margot poured the Chateau d'Yquem, her ears tuned to every word while her face remained professionally blank. It was Philippe who spotted her first, or rather, spotted her lack of engagement with the conversation. Philippe. Excusez-moi, mademoiselle, you speak French, yes? The question was asked in English, but there was something in his eyes. A test, perhaps, a curiosity. Margot felt the familiar heat of exposure, the danger of being seen. She had learned long ago to hide her fluency. Rich people said things in front of the help that they would never say to their equals. Her French had been her secret weapon, her invisible armor. Margot. Un petit peu, monsieur. A little, from high school. She saw something flicker in Philippe's expression. Disappointment? Suspicion? Before he nodded and turned back to the conversation. Ashworth hadn't even looked up from his foie gras. Marcus Ashworth. Dr. Reynard, perhaps you could walk us through the authentication process one more time, for the family's benefit. And that was when everything began to unravel. Dr. Reynard cleared his throat with the practiced confidence of a man who had given this speech 100 times. He reached into his leather portfolio and withdrew a stack of documents, their edges yellowed with what appeared to be age, their surfaces covered in the distinctive handwriting of 19th century French bureaucracy. Dr. Reynard. The provenance of Maison Fontaine is, quite simply, impeccable. We have here the original Charter of Incorporation from 1847, signed by Eloise Fontaine herself and witnessed by the prefect of Paris. We have the ledgers showing continuous operation through the Franco-Prussian War, both world wars and the economic upheavals of the 20th century. We have... Margot was refilling water glasses, her movements automatic, her mind wandering, until something snagged her attention like a fishhook. The handwriting on the 1847 charter. She had seen Eloise Fontaine's handwriting hundreds of times during her research. She had studied it under magnification, traced its evolution over decades, analyzed the pressure of the pen and the angle of the strokes. It was as familiar to her as her own mother's handwriting. And this was wrong, not obviously wrong, not wrong in a way that would catch a casual observer, or even a competent historian, but the flourish on the capital A. Eloise always looped it to the left, a distinctive quirk she had maintained throughout her life. This signature looped to the right. Margot's hand trembled, and a single drop of water splashed onto the tablecloth. She murmured an apology, dabbed at it with her napkin, and retreated to the serving station. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. It could be nothing. A slip of the pen on an important document. Age playing tricks with her memory. The lighting in this room distorting what she saw. But then Dr. Reynard switched to French. He was addressing Madame Colette, explaining some technical detail about the embroidery samples that had been carbon dated. His French was fluent, cultured, with the accent of the Parisian elite. Exactly what one would expect from a man of his credentials. Except he had just used the word échantillon to describe the fabric samples, which was perfectly correct. But then he said something that made Margot's blood freeze. Les échantillons ont été analysés à la Bibliothèque nationale dans les années 80. The samples were analyzed at the National Library in the 80s. No, they weren't. Margot had read every academic paper, every authentication report, every reference to Maison Fontaine's archives. The original fabric samples had been housed at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs until 1995, when they were transferred to the Fontaine family's private collection. They had never been at the Bibliothèque Nationale, not in the 80s, not ever. It was a small mistake, a tiny detail that no one in this room would catch. Not Ashworth with his billions, not even Madame Colette with her decades of family history. The samples, the dates, the institutions, these were the province of specialists, researchers, doctoral candidates who had spent years in dusty archives, people like Margot. She moved to the sideboard, pretending to reorganize the silver, while her mind raced. One mistake could be coincidence. Two could be coincidence. But the signature, the institutional history, a pattern was emerging. She thought of her training at the Sorbonne, of Professor Marchand, who had drilled into her class the sacred trinity of authentication, provenance, materiality, and context. A document could have perfect provenance on paper and still be a forgery if the materials were wrong. It could have authentic materials and still be fake if the context didn't hold. The best forgers knew this. They layered their deceptions, building false histories that could withstand cursory examination. But they always made mistakes. Always. Because no one could know everything about the past, no matter how brilliant they were. Except, perhaps, for the invisible people who had devoted their lives to learning it. Then Dr. Reynard did something that sealed her suspicion. He leaned toward his assistant, a nervous young man with a tablet, and murmured in rapid French, clearly believing that only the French speakers at the table could understand. Make sure the Girard documents are ready. We'll need them for the secondary authentication if the old woman asks more questions. Girard. The name hit Margot like a physical blow. Henri Girard was a forger, a brilliant, notorious forger who had been convicted in 2019 for creating fake provenance documents for old master paintings. His specialty was aging paper, replicating historical handwriting, and fabricating institutional records so convincing that they had fooled auction houses and museums for decades. He was currently serving 12 years in a French prison, but his techniques, his formulas, his methods, they were still out there, in the wrong hands. Margot looked at the documents spread across the table with new eyes. The charter, the ledgers, the authentication certificates. Suddenly, tiny details she had dismissed began to coalesce into a devastating picture. The paper of the 1847 charter had a subtle sheen that hadn't existed in mid-19th century French paper mills. The ink on the ledgers was iron gall, which was correct for the period, but the color was too uniform. Authentic iron gall ink oxidized unevenly over time, creating variations that forgers struggled to replicate. The witness signature from the Prefect of Paris used a spelling convention that hadn't been standard until 1863. Dr. Alain Reynard wasn't authenticating Maison Fontaine's heritage. He was fabricating it, and he was about to help Marcus Ashworth pay $800 million for a fashion house whose documented history was a lie. Margot's hand shook as she poured more wine. Her mind was screaming at her to do something, say something. But what? She was a waitress, a nobody, a woman in a uniform who was supposed to be invisible. Then Dr. Reynard switched back to English, but he was speaking to his assistant again, this time with a cruel little smirk. At least the American brought beautiful servers. That one, he nodded toward Margot, has a lovely face. Too bad she's clearly too stupid to understand anything we're saying. The assistant snickered. And something in Margot Bellamy, something that had been dormant for 4 years, buried under grief and debt and the daily humiliation of being invisible, woke up. The main course had arrived, a delicate preparation of turbot with beurre blanc, and the conversation had turned to the final terms of the acquisition. $800 million, a controlling stake, the future of French fashion history. Margot stood at the serving station, her hands folded, her face neutral. But inside, a war was raging. She thought of her mother in the facility in New Jersey, who sometimes forgot Margot's name, but never forgot the stories she had told her about Eloise Fontaine, the seamstress who had started with nothing and built an empire of silk and dreams. She thought of her dissertation, those 63 pages of love and scholarship, now moldering in a cardboard box. She thought of all the invisible women throughout history who had known the truth but had been too afraid, too poor, too powerless to speak it. She thought of Eloise Fontaine herself, who had been dismissed and underestimated at every turn until her needle proved mightier than all the swords of her detractors. Marcus Ashworth. I think we're ready to sign. Dr. Reynard, your authentication has been thorough and convincing. Madame Colette, your family's legacy will be in good hands. The papers were being passed around. Pens were being uncapped. $800 million was about to change hands based on documents that Margot was now certain were forgeries. She took a breath, and then she did something she had never done in 4 years of service. She interrupted. Margot, excusez-moi. Her voice was quiet, but the French was perfect. Not high school French, not tourist French, but the French of the Sorbonne, the French of academic conferences and doctoral defenses, the French of someone who had spent years swimming in the language like a native. Every head at the table turned toward her. Dr. Reynard's face went pale. Margot, continuing in flawless French. Dr. Reynard, I couldn't help but notice that you mentioned the fabric samples being analyzed at the Bibliothèque Nationale in the 1980s. That's curious because, according to the transfer records published in the Gazette des Archives in 1996, those samples were housed exclusively at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs until 1995. They were never at the National Library. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the candle flames seemed to freeze. Dr. Reynard, recovering quickly, You must have misheard me. The acoustics in these old rooms, Margot. I didn't mishear. She stepped forward, and something in her posture had changed. The invisible woman was gone. In her place stood someone else entirely, someone with straight shoulders and burning eyes and the quiet authority of certain knowledge. Margot. And I didn't misread Eloise Fontaine's signature on that charter. She looped her capital A to the left. Always. It was a distinctive quirk that every serious scholar of the period knows. The signature on your document loops to the right. Marcus Ashworth, sputtering. What the hell is going on? Who is this woman? But Margot wasn't finished. She picked up the charter, the document that was supposed to be worth $800 million, and held it up to the light. Margot. This paper has a surface sheen consistent with modern acid neutralization treatments. Authentic 1847 French paper was made with lime-based sizing that leaves a matte finish. And the witness signature, she pointed to the ornate script at the bottom, uses the spelling préfet with an accent grave. That orthographic convention wasn't standardized until the spelling reforms of 1863. In 1847, it would have been written without the accent. Dr. Reynard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Dr. Reynard. This is outrageous. I am the foremost authority on French fashion heritage. I will not stand here and be interrogated by a servant, Margot, calmly. Then perhaps you can explain why you mentioned Henri Girard's documents to your assistant, in French, which you assumed none of us would understand. The name landed like a bomb. Madame Colette gasped. Philippe Fontaine-Beaumont's hand moved instinctively toward his phone. Marcus Ashworth looked like he had been slapped. Marcus Ashworth. Gerard, the forger? What the hell does he have to do with... Margot, everything, Mr. Ashworth. She turned to face him directly, and for the first time in 4 years, she allowed herself to be fully seen. Margot. Henri Girard developed techniques for aging paper, replicating historical inks, and fabricating institutional records. He was convicted in 2019, and his methods were documented in the court proceedings. The documents Dr. Renard has presented tonight show multiple hallmarks of Girard's techniques: the paper treatment, the ink uniformity, the anachronistic orthography. She turned to the leather portfolio and began pulling out documents, her trained eye identifying each flaw with surgical precision. Margot. This ledger claims to show continuous operation through the Franco-Prussian War, but the page numbers are typeset in a font that wasn't available until 1889. This authentication certificate references a testing methodology that wasn't developed until 2015, but the certificate itself is supposedly from 1997. And this, she held up a photograph. This image of the original workshop shows a street in Montmartre that didn't exist until Baron Haussmann's renovations in the 1860s. The building in the background is the Sacré-Cœur, which wasn't completed until 1914. Dr. Renard's face had gone from pale to ashen to something approaching green. His assistant was already backing toward the door. Dr. Renard. This is absurd. These are minor discrepancies. Any authentication process. Philippe, his voice cold as ice. Dr. Renard, I think you should stop talking. He had his phone out now, and he was dialing. His eyes hadn't left Margot's face, but there was something different in them. Not suspicion anymore, but a dawning recognition. Philippe, into the phone. Inspector Beaumont? Yes, it's Philippe. I'm at La Maison Céleste. We have a situation that requires your immediate attention. Yes, document fraud. Potentially $800 million. The suspect is attempting to leave the premises. Dr. Renard made a break for the door, but the 2 young men in matching suits, who were, it turned out, not assistants at all, but private security, were faster. They blocked his exit with the practiced ease of professionals. Dr. Renard, desperate now. You don't understand. The real documents were lost decades ago. The Fontaine heritage is legitimate. I was just filling in the gaps, creating what should have existed. Margot, quietly, but with devastating finality. That's not authentication, Dr. Renard. That's forgery, and you were going to let Mr. Ashworth pay $800 million for fabricated history. She turned to Madame Colette, who had sat in stunned silence throughout the entire confrontation. Margot, gently, in French. Madame, I want you to know, the heritage of Maison Fontaine is real. Eloise Fontaine was a genuine revolutionary in French textile design, but somewhere along the way, someone, perhaps with good intentions, decided to enhance the documentation. The forgeries are recent. The legacy is not. Madame Colette's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She reached out and took Margot's hand. Madame Colette. Comment connaissez-vous notre histoire si bien, ma petite? How do you know our history so well, child? And for the first time that evening, Margot smiled. A real smile, not the trained one. Margot. Because I've spent years studying it, madam. It was my dissertation, my life's work. Before, she trailed off, but she didn't need to finish. Everyone in the room could hear what she wasn't saying. Before I became invisible. Part 5. The public fall of the antagonist. The next hour was chaos. Inspector Beaumont arrived with 3 officers and immediately took Dr. Renard into custody. The forger's composure had completely shattered. He was alternately pleading innocence, blaming unnamed co-conspirators, and demanding to speak to his lawyer in increasingly hysterical tones. His assistant had already been detained at the service entrance, where he'd been caught trying to destroy documents on his tablet. The preliminary examination of the files revealed a network of fabricated provenance documents spanning a dozen fashion houses across Europe, a systematic scheme to enhance the perceived heritage, and therefore the sale price, of luxury brands whose legitimate historical documentation had been lost or damaged over the decades. The total value of transactions facilitated by Reynard's forgeries was estimated at over $2 billion. Marcus Ashworth sat in stunned silence as the scope of the fraud became clear. He had nearly been the latest victim. $800 million for documents that would have been worthless the moment a real expert examined them under proper scrutiny. His legal team was already on the phone with their Paris office, their New York office, their forensic accountants. Marcus Ashworth, to his lawyer, his voice hollow. How did we miss this? We hired the best, the most expensive, the most respected lawyer. We hired reputation, Marcus, not expertise. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The most respected authenticator in the field had been the fraud, and the person who had exposed him was a waitress making $11.50 an hour. Pierre, the maitre d', had watched the entire scene unfold with growing horror. When the police began taking statements, he tried to pull Margot aside, hissing about professionalism and propriety and how she had embarrassed the restaurant. It was Philippe who shut him down. Philippe. That woman just prevented a fraud that would have destroyed my family's reputation and cost Mr. Ashworth the better part of $1 billion. If you say another word to her, I will personally ensure that La Maison Céleste never receives another reservation from anyone in my network again. Pierre went pale and retreated to the kitchen. As Dr. Renard was led out in handcuffs, past the other diners, past the chandeliers, past the world of luxury he had exploited for so long, he passed Margot. Their eyes met. Dr. Renard, spitting the words. "Who the hell are you?" Margot didn't answer. She didn't need to. Later, much later, after the police had taken their statements, after the other diners had been politely escorted out, after the restaurant had closed around them, the remaining party gathered in the chambre d'or. The candles had burned low. The food had long since been cleared, but no one seemed willing to leave. Marcus Ashworth sat with his elbows on the table, his silver hair disheveled for the first time that evening. Madame Colette was on the phone with the family lawyers. Philippe Fontaine-Beaumont stood by the window, his reflection ghostly in the dark glass. And Margot stood where she had always stood, by the serving station, in her uniform, invisible. Except she wasn't invisible anymore. Every eye in the room kept drifting toward her. Marcus Ashworth, finally breaking the silence. "Who are you?" The question hung in the air. Margot felt the familiar instinct to deflect, to minimize, to become invisible again. But something had changed. The woman who had stood up to Dr. Reynard couldn't go back into hiding. "Margot. My name is Margot Bellamy. I have a PhD in French material culture and fashion history from the Sorbonne. My dissertation was on the evolution of embroidery techniques in 19th century Parisian haute couture, with a particular focus on the founding houses, including Maison Fontaine." Philippe had turned from the window now, his eyes sharp with interest. "Philippe. That paper, The Golden Thread, Eloise Fontaine and the Birth of Modern French Embroidery. That was yours?" Margot blinked. "You've read it?" Philippe. "It's in our family library. My grandmother sent copies to every family member when it was published. She said it was the most accurate account of Eloise's work she had ever seen." Madame Colette had finished her call and was watching Margot with those sharp, ancient eyes. Madame Colette. I remember now. I wrote to you. 3 years ago, I invited you to visit the family archives. Margot's breath caught. She remembered that letter. It had arrived 2 weeks after her mother's diagnosis, when the medical bills were just beginning their avalanche. She had written back, apologizing, explaining that she was taking time away from academic work. She had never explained why. Margot. My mother was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. The medical care, she needed full-time memory care. The insurance didn't cover it. The bills. She trailed off. She didn't need to explain the rest. Everyone in the room understood what happened to dreams when reality came crashing in. Margot. I owed $240,000. I had a PhD and no job, so I started working here. The tips are good. I can visit her twice a week. The silence that followed was different from before. Not shocked, not curious, something deeper. Marcus Ashworth stood up slowly. For the first time since she had met him, he looked like a human being rather than a force of nature. Marcus Ashworth. Miss Bellamy, I've built 17 companies. I've made and lost fortunes. I've hired thousands of experts, analysts, consultants, and specialists. He paused. I have never, not once, been in a room where the most qualified person was the one carrying the water glasses. He walked toward her, and for a moment, Margot felt the instinct to step back, to defer, to become invisible again, but she held her ground. Marcus Ashworth. Tonight you saved me $800 million. You saved Madame Colette's family from a scandal that would have destroyed their reputation. You single-handedly exposed the biggest authentication fraud in fashion history. He paused. And you did it in a waitress uniform. He extended his hand. Marcus Ashworth. Miss Bellamy, I'd like to offer you a job. Margot stared at his hand like it was a foreign object. Margot. A job? Marcus Ashworth. I'm still going to acquire Maison Fontaine with legitimate documentation and proper authentication. And I'm going to need someone to lead the heritage division, someone who knows the history, someone who can spot a forgery at 50 paces, someone who can protect my investment from people like Renard. He paused. Marcus Ashworth. The position comes with a starting salary of $400,000, full benefits, a research budget, access to the Fontaine archives and any other collection you need, and a signing bonus of $300,000, enough to pay off your mother's medical debt and give you some breathing room. The numbers didn't feel real. Margot had spent 4 years counting pennies, skipping meals, wearing shoes until they fell apart. The idea of $400,000 a year, it was like being told she could fly. But something held her back. Margot. Mr. Ashworth, tonight you didn't listen to me until I forced you to. You looked right through me. Your expert called me stupid in French, and you didn't even notice. She took a breath. Margot. If I take this job, I need to know that I'll be listened to. Not because I made a scene, but because my expertise has value. I need real authority, not a fancy title that means nothing when the men in suits start talking over me. Ashworth's expression shifted, from offering to considering. He looked at her differently now, as if seeing her for the first time. Marcus Ashworth. What do you want, Margot? Veto power over any authentication or acquisition that involves historical documentation. A seat at the table when decisions are made about heritage, properties, and... She hesitated. This was the part that scared her the most. Margot. I want you to establish a scholarship fund for students who can't afford to pursue graduate studies in fashion history and material culture. Call it the Bellamy Fontaine Fellowship. Fund 5 students a year, full tuition and living expenses. Her voice wavered. Margot. My mother was the one who taught me to love history. Before the disease, she used to read me stories about the great fashion houses. She believed that beautiful things mattered. That craftsmanship was a form of love. She swallowed hard. I want other students to have the chance I almost didn't have, to study what they love without being crushed by debt. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Madame Colette rose from her chair, slowly, with the dignity of her 87 years, and crossed to stand beside Margot. Madame Colette, Monsieur Ashworth, if you are truly committed to honoring the Fontaine legacy, you will accept every one of this young woman's conditions. She placed a thin, elegant hand on Margot's arm. Eloise Fontaine started with nothing. She was dismissed, underestimated, told she didn't belong, and she built an empire. Her eyes were fierce. This one is cut from the same cloth. Ashworth looked between the two women, the matriarch who held the key to the acquisition he wanted, and the waitress who had just upended his entire understanding of expertise and value. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed, not unkindly, the laugh of a man who has just been taught a lesson. Marcus Ashworth. I've been building companies for 40 years. I've never had a job candidate negotiate like that. He extended his hand again. You have a deal, Miss Bellamy, all of it. The salary, the authority, the fellowship. I'll have my lawyers draft the paperwork tonight. Margot looked at his hand, and then she looked around the room, at the chambre d'or, with its painted ceiling and its crystal chandeliers, at the world of power and luxury that had always excluded her. She wasn't invisible anymore. She shook his hand. Margot, when do I start?